welcome you to Open House London's 2013 official launch. I would just like to make a sort of statement about our sponsors, which is actually 29 of the local authorities are actually helped to fund the programme. But we also have many of our other sponsors. This year we have Network Rail, Hutchison Whampoa, Elliott Wood, obviously BBC London has been a long-term sponsor of ours, AJ is also one, Margaret Howe. So we have a number of really wide range of sponsors and supporters, which without them actually the event would never be able to happen. We also have a number of corporate members of Open City as the organisation that organises the Open House London event. And that includes British Land, Derwent London, again Elliott Wood, Waterman Group, Rocket Investments and Henderson Global Investors. So again we have a wide range of supporters of the organisation. But obviously Open House London is our baby, it's our 21st birthday this year. It's gone strength to strength, and in fact the actual concept now has gone worldwide to 20 cities around the world. The newest one's coming is Buenos Aires in November. So we're really pleased that people go out and view and look at their city, look at the buildings, look at good design, and that is one of the key things about our particular programme. Tonight, though, is our first time we've actually created an open debate. It's our inaugural one, it's our pilot. If we had realised the response we were going to get from the public, which was 9,200 going into the ballot, we might have chosen a slightly larger venue. So it was very difficult to choose from that. So for those who got a place, you really did well against the other 9,200 and whatever. But the whole point is a public debate. There are some invited guests of ours, but also very much members of the public and the profession. When we put the question out, we asked them whether people felt it was London was building a sterile city. Actually 52% said yes, so 48% said no. So there's a real kind of question about how London is building or creating its future. So it's a very good time, I think, to have this debate about is London designing, building a sterile city. And I look forward, as I hope you all do, to some great discussions. And the real thing, it is a debate, it is a conversation with everybody. So I hope you will join in with us in this conversation. Razia, let you continue.
Thank you very much, Victoria. This is quite bizarre having to pass this on, but we'll do our best. Good evening, everyone. Thanks very much for coming. I'm just wondering what people's experience of the city was this evening, trying to get here in the hideous weather. We are going to be talking about whether London is building a sterile city, and to do that, we've got these four esteemed panellists. But I also want to say, before I introduce them, that as Victoria says, this is a debate, this is a conversation. So each of these panellists, who I'll introduce in a minute, are going to speak for 5 minutes to present their case. We are then going to have a conversation, but if you feel very strongly about anything that you're hearing, do please just raise your hand. What I don't want this to be is for you in the audience to take part right at the end, the last 15 minutes or so. So, and I always feel like it just creates a much better atmosphere if people start getting involved sooner rather than later. So you've all come to take part, so don't be shy. Okay, so I am going to start at my far left. Bob Allies is a partner of Allies and Morrison. It's an architectural practice which he founded with Graham Morrison in 1984. He trained at the University of Edinburgh and was awarded the Rome Scholarship in Architecture, and he has been a lecturer at the University of Cambridge. I'm not sure if you've all got bits of paper that tell you exactly who they are. I'm not going to read everything out, so do just have a look and see what else everybody on the panel has done. Steve Howlett, my immediate left, Chief Executive of PB Peabody, which of course, as most people must know, is one of London's largest and oldest housing associations. He's done many, many other things, but that's how I'm going to introduce you tonight. Leo Hollis, next to him, born in London, studied history, and he has written 2 books about the history of the capital. Here's the plug: The Phoenix, The Men Who Made Modern London, and The Stones of London, a history of London through 12 buildings. And Sue Illman is the president of the Landscape Institute and managing director of Illman Young. It's an award-winning landscape architecture practice based not in London but in Cheltenham. We didn't actually talk about who was going to go first, so I don't know who wants to go first. Who's feeling brave? Okay,
Yeah, okay, go, 5 minutes. Peabody's always pleased to take part in Open House London, and we've this year got 5,000. 5,000. We've got 5. Is this okay? This microphone. We've got 5 of our estates and centres in Open House London. So I do hope you'll go and see them. We've got 20,000 properties in London, housing 55,000 people, and soon we're going to take over into our group Thamesmead, which will take us up to 80,000 residents, and we're going to be embarking on a major programme of regeneration in terms of the economy and the social makeup of the area that actually will stop it being what has potentially been a sterile part of the city. So what do we mean by a sterile city? I would say no people, a lack of diversity amongst the population with narrow range of incomes and backgrounds, no trees, no grass, no birds, no wildlife, lots of concrete, lots of tarmac, stark, brutalist architecture, subterranean walkways. Elephant and Castle comes immediately to mind with those underpass, with a real sense of danger in the city. And I think in some parts there is a risk that at night people can feel there aren't people about, so am I safe? And perversely. But I think it's also the absence of leisure facilities, cinemas, bars, restaurants with people in the evening. And are we there? Well, actually, frankly, I don't think we are, but I do believe we are at risk of doing that, because last year we had our 150th anniversary, and the retired Bishop of Southwark, Tom Butler, said London citizens are its lifeblood. Enabling them to live in inner London is an essential component of the good and prosperous city. And the Bishop was right. But actually, I think we're at risk of driving people on low incomes out of central London into the suburbs. And actually, at that point, we do create the risk of a sterile city, both in central London, but actually also in the areas where, because of the desperate need for housing in London, actually we produce not very good new housing estates that don't take account of people, don't take account of trees and grass and wildlife. And I think we've really got to tackle that. And I think there are good reasons for making sure that people on low incomes can live in central London. London's economy needs those people here. Mr. Sarkozy needs somebody to clean his flat and act as porter and so on. And the CBI actually says that actually the most significant constraint on growth in central London is the lack of an adequate labour supply, and we do need people on low incomes to be there. That's been a part of Peabody forever. I would also say that there's a quality of life issue, the second one here, that London's a patchwork of diversity and tolerance, and we need to keep that. And London attracts the brightest and the best talent in the world, partly because of the nature of our city. And it's not a city that's exclusively for the rich. We want to live in mixed neighbourhoods that are stimulating and lively. And a ghetto doesn't suit either the rich or the poor, frankly. And I think there is a risk in this of potential social conflict developing, and that's happened in cities like Paris, where they've had the donut of people being moved out into the periphery. We value a life where we share the same streets, the same transport systems, the same police force, the same bin men, and so on. Actually, that's what makes this a city that we want to live in. But ultimately, the ghettoisation in low cost, low value areas is not going to help anybody. So the first conclusion for me is that we've got to stop this exodus of people who can't afford to live in central London, and we really need to make sure that those people are able to live in our city centres, and that needs a change of attitude of a lot of people, but especially government, in trying to facilitate that to happen. It's an investment, I would say. The second point is that quality matters. We believe that actually if we're going to provide people with a good home, a real sense of purpose and a strong feeling of belonging, it's not just enough to provide a roof over their head. We need a good quality home that's big enough that when they come out of the front door, there's a nice area in front of them. We do have to increase the volume of homes, but we're seeing Section 106 agreements watered down, offices converted to residential homes that really aren't suitable to do that, and we need to stop that. But I do, the bright point is that I do think it is recognised, and if you look about London, you'll see areas where those communities are being rebuilt again. In East London, around Stratford and the Olympic Village, in Newham, Tower Hamlets, and I would say Hackney, we're developing there, and it's the community is changing. In SE1 around Elephant and Castle, and I think the underpasses at Elephant and Castle are dreadful, but there are ideas and plans to get rid of them and actually provide a park, new homes, leisure facilities, getting rid of the Haygate, which was a blight, I would say. So the final point, my third point, is that to be vibrant, London needs to be mixed and therefore affordable. But that shouldn't be a compromise in terms of the quality of homes and the surrounding environment. We need genuinely affordable quality homes, not that they're not ones that just look pretty, but it's in the sense of designing out crime, about designing in support, community buildings, allotments, cycle sheds, shops, transport business and so on. And this is the sort of additional community value that I think people in London will value and will make this city continue to be not a sterile city, but a vibrant one.
Thank you very much, Steve. Leo, let's have you going next, because on one level you wouldn't disagree with the opening statement about people being at the heart of the city and the diversity of people at the heart of the city. So over to you.
No, absolutely. What I'd like to propose is, in some ways, a sort of a social urbanism. It's an often repeated truth that cities are made out of people and not buildings. And it is too easy to see this as a piece of rhetoric, a bit like saying your call is important to us, or putting customers first. It feels like a nice advertising jingle, when in fact it is an idea of real power that can really transform the way we look at the city. If we really believe that cities are made out of people rather than buildings, what we're asking today is, are we building a sterile community? Does London offer less than the sum of its human parts? Is it running a deficit on its social capital? At the heart of this question is the fear that we're losing something, that we were once vibrant and now are losing this energy or this vitality. We're constantly being told that London is one of the top 2 cities of the world. It is a cultural capital. It's the epicenter of the financial world. Billionaires want to live here, and we're supposedly bathing in the afterglow of the Olympics. And yet all we see is great temples to capital rising about us for the first time, designed by big-name architects. So why do we feel so anxious? And what are we mourning? I think that we read the city wrong, and in this 5 minutes I want to highlight just one area. And what I really want to discuss is the need to discuss public spaces within the city. And so I'll start with an example that doesn't come from London, but it comes from Copenhagen and Strøget, which is a very famous example designed by the Danish architect Jan Gehl in the 1960s. And what he created was a vast central pedestrianised area in the centre of the city. He got rid of the cars and he allowed people to walk around this central space. Initially, people were against this idea. They said, we're Danish, not Italian. And yet, within months, there was a surprising effect. People started to gather here. Cafes started to put their tables out onto the streets. And so why were they coming? Very quickly, there were street performances. The police thought that these were obstructions to people's daily lives, and they started to move these street entertainers on. But soon Jan Gehl decided to go back and actually look at what people were doing. And what he found that while they would stop in front of windows and look at what was going at the cinema, the thing that people did most and the thing that people wanted to do most in this place was come and see other people. People are interested in people. An example of a good urban space is a city that is created around people. So we need to think harder about the spaces and the life between buildings as much as we do about the built environment itself. And one of the greatest threats that faces London today, I think, is the continued loss of public space and the depletion of the public realm. It is here that the future vibrancy of the city depends. And it is one that needs to be debated, but should also act as a call for arms for action. Now, there are lots of debates about what public space is. We can obviously see that places like parks or squares, the high street and the ground in front of palaces, these places in which historically people have come together, these are obviously public spaces. But there are also lots of other different public spaces that we ignore. We're thinking of the commons as set out by Eleanor Ostrom, or third places by Ray Oldenburg. And these are some of the everyday places that people come together. How can we forget Jane Jacobs herself, who talks about the ballet of Hudson Street, the diurnal, the sort of the daily motion, interaction that goes on an ordinary street, almost without being noticed. Jane Jacobs was very influenced by another American writer called William H. White, who in The Social Life of Small Social Spaces would record how people spent their lunch on Seagram Plaza, or watch people, what they did outside the front door of Saks Fifth Avenue. All these places should really be included in what we think of the public realm. These are the places where we live our everyday lives. Now, why is the public realm important? I believe that we're social animals and we're meant to be together, and it is in the public spaces of the city that we learn these rules. Here we find the alchemy of proximity, a complex interweaving of moments and transactions and conversations, histories, lessons, rituals, of getting on with each other. It is also these public spaces where we sort out our differences, the antagonisms and conflicts and rivalries. Without the public spaces of the city, we cannot learn the civic rules that make the city more than the sum of its parts. And how do we learn these? We are taught these lessons from each other. This cannot be imposed by an authority from above. Cooperation is generation from the bottom up. This is what Jane Jacobs talks about when she talks about the eyes on the streets. And this can only occur in places that are fair, equitable, and commonly shared by the public. So if London is becoming more sterile, it is not a result of the way we design, but because of the loss of actual public spaces where we can come together. It is easier to chart this loss than it often creates moments of crisis and confrontation. I'm thinking of Occupy in 2011, where we suddenly realised that some of the main spaces that we had come together in the centre of the city were no longer publicly owned. I'm also thinking more recently of the South Bank, which is perhaps one of the most successful public spaces in the city, but even as we speak there is this debate about the skate park, and that is really at the heart of what this kind of idea of what public spaces is. We see this debate also in the proliferation of advertising on the surfaces of the city, as well as the divisions within the city itself. London is becoming increasingly unequal, and this inequality becomes geography, and we see this through private security. So we're depleting these public spaces, and this is what we need to debate. And I'm being rushed, I can tell. Yeah. Okay, so I will end by sort of saying, so we need to think about how best to create this life between the buildings, and it's not just design, it's also a process. And so I hope we'll be able to continue this debate later on.
There'll be plenty of time to say much more than what you just have. Leo, thank you very much. Bob, Alaz, I'm going to go to you next, just because we're talking about the built environment, and we're talking about not just homes that we build, but public spaces, as we just heard from Leo. So given what he just said about architects having some responsibility for not necessarily only focusing on big iconic buildings, let's hear what you've got to say about whether you think London is building a sterile city.
Okay, well, is London building a sterile city? I suppose I think the answer to this question is no. So my weekend was spent thinking how to spend 5 minutes saying no. I mean, I think when I look back to what London was like when I arrived here, which is almost 40 years ago, I would say that London has never felt better, really, than it does today. I think it feels more open, I think it feels more diverse, I think it feels more stimulating. It's a more interesting place to live. Now, clearly, it's not, there are other places which might be doing things better. You know, it's not perfect, I don't want to be complacent. There are a lot of other cities, Copenhagen's already been mentioned, which is fairly extraordinary actually in the way it runs itself as a city. And so, you know, we must keep looking for other ways of doing things. Nor, I think, should one forget that London is a very, very big place, and whatever qualities I might sense in the parts of London I occupy are probably not evident everywhere. So if there are good things, probably they should be spread much more widely than they are. So there's a lot to do, but I think it would be wrong to say we're building a sterile city. But what might be right is to say that there are sterile areas of the city which we still haven't put right, if you like. There is probably, in other words, an inheritance of parts of the city which don't work well and where there is still a great deal to do. So what I just try to think about is why has this question been posed? What is it that people are concerned about? And I suppose that I feel, and maybe this in the end is me rather than people, but I mean, I suppose there is a possibility that in areas of new development in London, the bits, if you like, that we're building, that when people experience those, that they might feel sometimes that there's a lack of variety, if you like, a lack of variety between places, which you could also phrase as a lack of distinctiveness. I mean, our place is becoming more uniform in the character of places that we're building. And is there also in some ways a lack of authenticity in these new places? I mean, and therefore are they less interesting than other places that we're losing? And I think in a way there is a certain truth in that. But I also think one has to acknowledge the fact that when one is building a new piece of a city, it's about as hard a thing as you can possibly do, I think. I think trying to kind of inject the level of complexity and richness that one enjoys in an established piece of city into a new piece is immensely difficult to do. Not just in terms of the task of the designer or the planner, but actually because of the sort of pressures that go, the economic pressures that go into this process. And I mean, at its very simplest, the fact that rental levels in new buildings are going to be higher than they are in old buildings a bit further away. So inevitably, in a way, you don't get the same sort of activities going on in these new developments that you might see elsewhere. Now, I mean, paradoxically, you could say, well, yes, you know, but why don't people try harder? You know, can't you manage these things? And of course, in the end, you can manage these things, and there are places where the management of uses and activities and the life of a place has been very successful. But I think equally, the more you manage it, the less authentic it gets. So you're kind of caught in a paradox about trying to achieve this richness and yet feeling you're responsible for organising yourself. So I think the reality is that you have to accept the new pieces of the city, the bits we're building, have to gradually evolve and find their place. And that you have to accept that in many cases the most interesting bits of a city are always going to be the pieces that are on the margins, the pieces that are on the edge, the places where property is cheap, where places which are going to attract artists to rent studio space, or small businesses to set up, or chefs to open their first restaurants, or families to move to because there's more space because it's cheaper. And these sorts of areas, that sort of life is not just an interesting kind of phenomenon that has to be going on. It's actually fundamental to the way that a city like London works. I mean, in some ways, for me, it's the most interesting the most interesting aspect of London, that certainly since the Second World War, there have been these kind of waves of discovery and colonisation which have swept across London and moved into different areas which were, for various reasons, neglected or downgraded, or where uses had changed, and people have moved in this really unplanned way, I mean in a kind of ad hoc way, and put a level of social investment into the place, and through that process they have changed. So I don't know quite where you start, but I guess you'd probably start in sort of Pimlico and Chelsea after the war. Then you've certainly got King's Road in the 60s. You've got Notting Hill. And then more recently you've got Clerkenwell, and then I don't know, today it's Bermondsey, maybe then it's Hackney Wick, Walthamstow. This phenomenon is just continuously rolling across the capital. People are worried about this, they're worried about, gentrification, it's a rather kind of unsatisfying description of it. I actually think it's a very positive thing, but equally it's not something that I think should be fixed. I don't think we should control it, I don't think we should say once it's happened, let's protect this phenomenon. Actually, I'm desperate for those very same people, or their children, to then move somewhere else, because actually it's a very positive thing. You actually need this sense of a dynamic within a city, it seems to me. So,
Almost out of time.
almost out of time. Okay, well then I'll just finish by saying one thing. So therefore, I think a healthy city is one in which there is no kind of total control or total power. In the end, it is a kind of balance of power, and you need all these different types of people, local authorities, GLA, private developers, individuals, operating around each other. And what you actually don't want is a situation where any one of those groups, when one of those categories begins to hold the day.
Thanks very much. Sue, let's hear from you about your ideas about whether the needs of the city are sustainable in the most environmentally sound way.
Thank you. So for me, is London sterile? Well, I think it's that, a bit like the curate egg. It's good in parts, very good in parts, but I do have serious concerns that there are some very difficult areas that probably are sterile, and a lot of those problems perhaps are in the suburbs and areas that we really must seek to address. I think, Bob makes the point very well, cities are continually changing, and what really concerns me is why it changes, how it changes, and what informs and guides how we make those changes, and I think that's particularly important now. So how we plan and design our urban spaces, not only in London, is absolutely critical if we are to create livable cities, and by that I mean cities that are economically, environmentally and socially sustainable. Places where people want to be. And if we do that, then those cities in London will be vibrant. But I think there's an urgency to actually relearn urbanism from that sustainable standpoint. And London and other cities are going to have to meet the demands of increasing population, and that need is going to be, and their needs, and that's going to be exacerbated by climate change. And we all know that's going to bring hotter periods. We've seen the droughts, we've seen the floods, and the consequences, not only for business and industry, but particularly for the quality of people's life, their health and well-being, and their lifestyle. Places must be responsive to the needs of people, and not just in a functional way, but in a way that provides a healthy environment and a safe environment, and one that can deal with the pressures of transportation, drought, flooding, air and water pollution, demands on energy, and one that fosters social cohesion, and more importantly, provides a level of delight, or as well, I should say. Places to live, work and play that respect history, but also contemporary needs. So the design of city spaces and the way we use green infrastructure, our city trees, our green sustainable drainage systems, parkland planting and green spaces is absolutely fundamental. And does London do that? Well, we've got a history of fantastic urban parks and squares, from the oldest deer parks to the Victorians' contributions. And we've got some really excellent contemporary examples where we're really starting to address these contemporary issues. And just say like the Olympic Park, the works that they did along the river not only improved water quality for the city, but took 5,000 homes out of flooding. But we've got this huge legacy of development and city space that demonstrably hasn't provided an appropriate environment for people. But many people actually still live there, and I think that is our real challenge. The thing is, we know that we can do all of this, and it is being done elsewhere in creating livable, sustainable cities. Melbourne in particular has championed the concept of water-sensitive cities, and that's an area I'm particularly interested in and have been promoting. And they've done that because of the problems that they've had of serious flooding, then they had extreme drought, and then they experienced extreme temperature. And that's made them address those issues comprehensively. And Portland, again, a city that I've had having a lot to do with. And there they've used attractively designed green infrastructure and sustainable drainage systems in their city to alleviate severe water pollution problems. And our response seems to be, let's just have a big tunnel. So many cities worldwide really are addressing this whole issue of livability and sustainability with enthusiasm. And I think my point is we need to do it here. And it's not just about making beautiful places, although clearly, I'm a designer, that's fundamental. But we've got to consider this sustainability, but we've got to also consider it at every scale, everywhere, all the time, not just big set pieces. It should be a fundamental part of what we do. So ask the question, well, who should lead it and who should be involved? Well, let's start at the top. We absolutely must have leadership, and we should have that leadership from government, in London, from the GLA, but certainly from government. That doesn't seem to be where they want to be at the moment, but we do need it at a strategic level. I think local authorities have a tremendous role to play in this, and I think they really can do fantastic work, and have done in London, where they become leaders and facilitators, bringing together development and local communities to actually enable better quality places, a more holistic regeneration, and the provision of new public places that are relevant to the local communities and locally distinctive. I think the professions have an important role to play, and I think we need to do that by thinking more outside the box, by collaborating together, and by educating clients about what can be achieved in our cities. We have some very good clients, and clearly there are very good developers in London, and particularly those who are landowners and holders and who have an interest in the value of their developments and their land, and who are in it for the long haul. We've got people like Land Securities and the Grosvenor Estates, Argent at King's Cross, and Peabody obviously, who really do understand and get it about what it is that we're trying to do, and that environmental considerations are important for people. And in Victoria there's been fantastic work going on through the Business Improvement District because of the problems of overheating, because of the problems of air quality, because of the problems of flooding. And they really do understand, and businesses understand, and the people understand, that if we can get that right, it will make their part of the city more livable. And last but absolutely not least is about community, and the fact that we've got to do some of this from the bottom up. We've got to engage with people appropriately in local communities, and we've got to engage them through the planning process. And that way we can make sure that cities are not sterile, and that way we can also ensure that we make places that are locally distinctive and locally relevant and vibrant.
Thank you very much. There's a huge amount in what all of you have said. I wonder if we can just start by unpacking it just a little, by focusing first on the difference between experiencing the city in terms of the public spaces, which is what Leo, you and Bob have touched on much more than the other two, and then also how we live and where we live, which seems to be much more to do with the domestic realm. Let's start with the public sphere first. Do Do you think, Leo, that when you talk about this sort of mourning for something that doesn't exist, I mean, there are spaces that are brilliant in London, aren't there? Are we talking about replicating that? Are we talking about being informed by it in a way that is particular to each district of London? What is it that you think needs to happen that will really make people feel that their experience of being in the city is more distinctive than it is now?
I think the question of mourning is more to do with the question that we're having today, rather than a sort of constant feeling that we have within the city. I mean, I think we have, I suppose, reduced our view of what the public spaces are. So we don't talk about sort of streets and pavements anymore as public spaces, and I think we need to sort of re-engage with those spaces. I think particularly by increasing our ideas of where the public spaces of the cities are, we will sort of see that they're out there, and that these are the places where, so our streets don't become sterile. Just our ordinary, where we live outside the front of our house, isn't just a place that you cross. It's actually a place where extraordinary things can happen, that it is part of the city rather than part of, you know, a sort of private space. I think sort of connecting it very much with that sort of sustainability argument is that as soon as you make somewhere sustainable, you also make it far more democratic and far more equal. And so it's a combination of things of thinking about a public space. A green space is a place which is shared, and I think that's absolutely essential. I do think that a place only becomes public because people use it. It's not like you can just sort of fence off an area and sort of saying, go, that's public, go and use it. So people actually do have to leave their houses. They do have to go to these public places, and what will get them there is other people.
Bob, there isn't an architect that I've spoken to in the last 3 years who doesn't talk about sustainability, who doesn't talk about community and public space. So why is it that there is still such a gap between the objective, the goal, which appears to be one that everybody shares, and what we actually experience? Sorry to put you on the spot like that.
Well, I think in the world in which we all operate, I'm going to be cynical really, but I think that we develop a vocabulary that we use to talk about these things, and there are lots of words. Sustainability is one, permeability is another one, landmark buildings, gateway, all sorts of terms that get fed into the planning process and the conversation about the city. And one of the problems is that these words are very easy to use and to talk about, but that lots of projects don't actually deliver what they are saying they're going to do. And actually, when you look at drawings, it's really hard to tell, to be quite honest, whether they're going to or not anyway.
It's part of the problem that there is too much emphasis on the notion that a big project, a big iconic building will be the big draw, which will be the one that will change people's perceptions of the city, as opposed to thinking about it much more organically and tailoring buildings or buildings.
Iconic buildings are completely hopeless in terms of the city. They don't mean anything at all, really. The most important things in terms of making cities, or at least shall we say adding buildings to cities or carrying out interventions in cities, is actually the relationship between the new and what already exists. It's in a way, when you add something new, it may be good or bad in its own terms, but if it's really going to contribute to the way the city works, the most important thing is what happens on its edge and its relationship with the existing city round about itself. And every new project really should see itself as having a duty and an obligation to make the rest of the city work better around itself. I think a fraction of the projects which get built actually behave like that. There's still a tendency, architects are particularly guilty of this, of being most interested in what they're doing and much less interested in everything else. But in the end, it is these relationships that you design when you're designing buildings in the city, which are so important. The thing which I think is complicated for London and has made it very challenging, I think will make it be only more challenging in the years ahead, is that as the population of London grows so much, I think we're talking about another 1 million people in 10 years, that the challenge of providing places for people, that many people to live in London, without, if and I would take it as granted that we're not going to move outside into the green belt, then actually we are witnessing a change in the character of London during this period. So that we can't, it's kind of pointless now to say, well, let's look after this thing we've got and just make it work a little bit better. That's not enough, actually. We do actually have to embrace the idea that the character of London will change as it houses more people.
So Steve, over to you as somebody who's involved in helping more people find places to live, which we're now kind of shifting over into London as is experienced as a place where we live, as opposed to just somewhere that we experience and pass through it, and we go off and live elsewhere. So tell me whether you're informed by exactly the same sorts of concerns that Bob's talking about at the Peabody Estate.
Yeah, very much so. Obviously, it's very difficult to develop in central London now, and so in a sense, I think the change in terms of housing, particularly for people on low incomes. So I think us actually changing the landscape of central London in a housing sense is going to be very difficult. But there are opportunities, and we are finding them. One of them is that we look at the housing we've got at the moment in central London, and we make sure that it's fit for purpose for the future. And I'm thinking of one of our 1930s estates at Clapham Junction, which has got 325 homes there. It's got a wall around it, and it stops people coming in, and it really is was a sterile area. And we're knocking it down and doubling the size, creating a pedestrian thoroughfare, which is exactly what Leo said. We're creating a new public space. People never went there, but they will come in and talk there. And I'm very keen on allotments and the old washing lines that you used to get on housing estates. Actually, people go and talk. We've got laundry rooms where you go, and there are loads of people there sort of folding their washing and so on. And I think creating those spaces. But there are other opportunities. I'd like to pay. We've mentioned the Olympic Village. I'd like to highlight what used to be known as the Ferrier Estate, and what Berkeley Homes have done there. They've created somewhere called called Kidbrooke Village, and it's actually unrecognisable. And it's not just there in a reasonably close area to central London. There's areas like Erith where there's a local authority tower block estate knocked down to create Erith Park, and it will be unrecognisable. I think there are areas, and what's happening around Elephant and Castle is really interesting. Zone 1 at Zone 2 prices. I think we have a potential to change those areas, and we've really got to be alive and aware of it. We've done well out of Section 106. We've got one as a result of the Regent Street development, not very far away from Regent Street, where we're housing people on the old social rents.
Just explain what Section 106 is.
Section 106 is a planning sort of basically the deal on a commercial planning development that people have to provide some sort of social benefit, which actually I have to say some local authorities aren't very good at doing. And I've mentioned around Elephant and Castle, and I don't think enough was made of the Section 106 there. But actually in other boroughs they're taking the money as well, the money and run. But actually what we need is the provision of a housing. So a Section 106 is part of the deal. So for instance, you might find 100 new homes, and 35 of those will be required to be affordable homes as a result of the Section 106. Actually, Barrett's have built a swimming pool and leisure centre in Lewisham as their Section 106. And I'd love it to be housing, but actually at least that is a contribution to the local community that's going to act as a hub and add a bit of life. And I think of some of the squares. Actually, Woolwich Squares, the General Gordon Place. It's one of the Open House London events at the weekend. It's really vibrant. What partly makes it vibrant is people go there, sit. There's nice areas, water. There's not. I heard once somebody's talk very disparagingly about the bit of sculpture in the middle of a public square. People think you can have sort of slabs of concrete and I don't know whether I should say this, but a granite turd in the middle of the of the square, and that constitutes a vibrant space. It doesn't actually. I think of some of our estates where we have people from surrounding areas in Westminster coming and having their lunch there. A Conservative MP once said to me, I said to him, "We've got an estate near where you live." He said, "I know, my kids play there." That's what we want, a mix of people. Sorry, I've forgotten your question.
That's fine. My question doesn't matter. It's you talking. So do you think that there's a potential contradiction in talking about sustainability and at the same time wanting to create distinctive housing, for instance? Because Bob was talking about one of the real challenges is that you begin to lack distinctiveness and that there isn't variety because it needs to be sustainable, affordable, etc. It then becomes homogenous.
Absolutely not. I mean, I think that's the design challenge, and that's where we want to be. And it depends on how you start on the basis of your design. So you need to take on board, and it's very much something that we do, the whole issue of landscape character, and that's equally true in the urban environment. And I think you then have to mix that, not only that with the history of the place and the needs and desires of the community. And every part of London is completely different in that respect, and that ought to enable us to be sufficiently creative to respond to that and use that as the point of departure in what it is that we're designing. Sustainability is something that underpins it, and we just need to integrate it intelligently. You can't do everything everywhere, and sometimes you just have to prioritise what's most important and what's most effective to incorporate. So, we're not stupid about it, but there is a real challenge, I think, for the design professions to be as imaginative and as innovative as they can in the way that they address those challenges, and see what synergies that you can get through that cross-professional collaboration, because that's the way that we can get the best out of it. And it doesn't have to be the most expensive solution at all, because sometimes, just thinking about things differently and having those conversations can enable you to come forward with, practical, sensible, responsive solutions. So, lots of ways to skin that cat, I think.
We've talked quite a lot about community. I'm just going to mention very quickly the virtual community, which if you are on your smartphones as we're speaking and you're on Twitter, the hashtag is open debate. So do comment on granite turds or whatever else you want to. The gentleman here.
I think Steve made some interesting points. One about stop the exodus, and you mentioned Haygate. It's quite clear that people who exercise their right to buy, for example, there, are getting such a small amount on compulsory purchase. Their home ownership has been set back tremendously. People are being displaced by gentrification and estate renewal in a way which is appalling. They gave evidence on that to the last examination of the London plan, and it was compelling. These people are being driven out of inner and central London, but they can't afford the transport costs to come back to the jobs they still hold. This is damaging to the economy of central London, and very bad for those people's lives. The other aspect about sterile is we're selling so much off-plan to overseas buyers. I don't know if you've been into some of these places where only half of the places are occupied. The people who then live there feel as though something's gone wrong, it's not safe, it's empty. I thought I was in a community. And then we have the ugly buildings. And it's refreshing to hear Peabody say at the NLA that one of the best building materials is still brick. And the Evening Standard tonight tells us we're going to have another Gothic city in the city. It's going to be, as some people said, terribly ugly. And I think the privately owned public space between some of those buildings is challenging to what Leo was saying about getting it to really work properly. And I think those are all adverse influences.
Would anyone on the panel like to just respond to any of those things? I was intrigued by. Well, let's get you, Bob, to say something about the gentrification since you mentioned it.
Well, sorry. I mean, yeah, I'm sure that issue is a very important one actually, of people being displaced through these processes, and a very difficult one to manage. Certainly, if you move people away from the sector, people who are on low pay, or people who are unemployed, or people who form part of the kind of service industry to the city, then that is inherently a bad thing. It makes life harder for them. You know, it is much better to build more affordable housing closer to the centre. I mean, one fundamental thing about London, or about any city, is that cities are essentially the most sustainable way we have to live. The closer we live together, the lower our carbon footprints, the better our transport systems, the more access we have to services and facilities. So density really does make sense, and if we shouldn't be displacing people out and moving away from the centre, we should be doing completely the opposite of that. In terms of the way buildings, whether buildings are ugly or not, it is interesting that Peabody are very consciously building brick buildings. In fact, we're building brick buildings for Peabody, and are a great believer in brick buildings. But I mean, one reason for that, and it's again, it's an interesting aspect, and maybe I'm not sure this is a general thing. This is really true of Britain, maybe more than anywhere else. But what Peabody do, what people who build housing do, they are the people who make our cities. Actually, housing very rarely changes once it's built. I mean, yes, it does. You know, the Haygate estate is coming and going, but essentially, the people who build housing are the people who are making our city for us. Other buildings, office buildings, retail buildings, hospitals, schools, all those other buildings, they just come and go. They have a life. They last 25 years, 50 years, whatever it is, and then they get replaced. But the decisions we make about housing, well, two things really. One is the decisions we make about housing are really important because they actually are, I think, provide the structure to the city. And secondly, the decisions that architects make and their clients make about the materials they use are also very important, because there's nothing worse than buildings that start to fall apart after 10 or 15 years, and where the costs come back on people. I'll just say one other kind of curiosity about Section 106 things, and in a way it all sounds great, doesn't it, the way you said that the Section 106 provides all these things to the public. I must say I do think it's slightly odd at the moment that if you're a young couple buying your first flat in a new scheme, you're the people who have to pay the tax that goes to everybody else to provide the leisure centre or the park or whatever it is. In other words, it is quite a good way of getting a dividend back into the community. But you have to acknowledge that if these flat prices go up and up, because they're the ones who are producing the money to do it. And it just doesn't seem equitable to me. I still feel there must be a better way of achieving these public services than getting it from the people who live in the buildings. I mean, I know everybody thinks it comes from the developer, but it doesn't really. It still comes from the people who buy the flats or rent the flats.
I wonder if anyone wants to say anything about the overseas buyers issue, because it's partly to do with, I suppose I'm prompted to ask a question about the ownership of the city and feeling that you can say that you're a Londoner and that this city belongs to you. Leo?
Well, I mean, there are heaps of statistics. The top 10% of London are 273 times richer than the bottom 10%. Last year, 10,000 families were removed out of London by their councils, and that is only going to increase because of the cap, or what Boris Johnson calls Kosovan-style ethnic cleansing. And yet, within places like within Zone 1, something like, I think it's 34% of houses are dark houses, i.e. the lights are not on. And I think I'm right in saying that within Zone 1s and 2, something like 71% of all new houses bought last year were bought from people outside of Britain. what this does is it creates an unequal city, and that I think is absolutely critical to the civic life of the metropolis. I think it's the one area where I'm really very concerned. Not because sort of, people coming in, because London has always been a port of call, and London has always been extraordinarily good at bringing people together and them mixing and them becoming Londoners. I think it's because of the divisions, and these divisions are becoming geography, and these divisions are then becoming sort of permanent within the city. And so the solution isn't one that's just going to be designed. I think it's a decision that we have to collectively take about what kind of city that we live in, and it is not on the shoulders purely of architects and designers, but also on our leaders. So I think it really does start there, because without more equality, we can't really have a trusting place, and cities really depend on trust for us to really work together.
There was a hand up that went up over there.
London's always drawn people in, and in fact, until about 20, 30 years ago, our population was falling. It's now rising again. So that means something is drawing people in. But our real goal is actually, when we talk about sterility, I mean, in my 50 years in London, I have seen green spaces increase. When you've got behind there what Ealing's doing, which is North Isle Park, we're just in section 106 about to build a 5th mountain. And that's part of our attempt to green the A40. So that's one authority to do something. But actually my experience as a walker, I walk the Thames. Now in my time here, it's now at the state where I can walk from Pumping House, it's called, on the boundaries of Kingston, to the River Darren at the other end, along the whole south bank of the Thames. Now right, there are bits where you can't quite make it, but there are more and more becoming open. Ditto on the north, you can do it from Hampton, or as far as the Lee. I wish to do the bit beyond the Lee, but you can't get as far as the Lee at the moment. But all that has opened up during my time, well not all of it obviously, but it's opened up while I've been here in London. And ditto, we've got the Capital Ring, the London Loop, the Lee Valley's been opened up. So anyone who wants to walk London, there are plenty of places to walk, and they're getting better. So things are improving, at least in one way.
Thank you very much. I mean, that's a huge... Sue, I mean, that's a huge positive thing, isn't it? I mean, London has transformed enormously, and I always used to think, I've lived in London since I was 8, and I always wondered why the river was sort of left dormant, and that's changed enormously, hasn't it?
Yeah, I think it has, and I think it's been quite interesting because we've run several competitions as the Institute, and looking at how spaces could be used in London. And there's actually some of the exits are next door, so people can see them later. And it was really surprising the number of people who chose to make their submissions around the rivers in London. And there is this whole discovering all of the rivers, because it is the fundamental of any city. All principal cities are built on rivers. It's the trade route, it's everything about the life and heart of the city. And we have neglected it badly for an awfully long time. But a huge amount has been done and still needs to be done. And it's not just about accessibility, it's also about dealing with these issues of urban water pollution, and those problems get more and more. And when we're addressing the one, we need to address the other as well.
Nonsense. The Thames is cleaner now than it's ever been. You can catch salmon by the Houses of Parliament.
Yeah, but it's not just
this things ain't what they used to be. It's just rubbish. And I'm absolutely with the councillor over here. I've been.
Do you want to say, is it relevant what you do professionally or not?
If you like, I'm a builder. But,
okay.
And so I work for many of the clients who are described here. I'm Miles Delap from Cardiff, and but to say that things ain't what they used to be is just rubbish. London has been getting better and continues to get better and continues to delight us, and actually we couldn't stop it if we tried. And if it was as bad as we're trying to be, I mean, Bob's beating himself up saying that architects don't get it right all the time. In my experience, architects get it right more often than they don't, but heck, we're not perfect, and if we don't try and make things better, then then they definitely won't.
What about this notion that there needs to be a much more holistic approach, as well as the idea that which we've heard quite a lot of about, which is that there is an inherent inequality that's emerging in the city. It's polarising. The economics is polarising the way in which the city functions.
It's certainly right to say that we need an holistic approach, but I've yet to find an architect that doesn't want to continue to take over the rest of the world. Alan's sitting over there, and we're doing a project with Great Ormond Street where it's the most we can do to stop them from taking over the whole of of Guildford Street and Cornwall Fields. In terms of your other point, the polarisation, for sure there are parts of London which are becoming polarised, which are becoming sterile in Steve's terms, because they're becoming unidimensional in cultural terms. And actually, if people want to live there, let them do it. I'm quite happy to stay in my nice mixed area in Greenwich, and I celebrate that. The central zones are not becoming polarised, and the public realm, the spaces between the buildings, are colonised, whether we like it or not. I'm doing with the Portland estate a scheme in Baker Street to try and turn that two-way and improve the environment there. There's a similar scheme in Tottenham Court Road, and those schemes are about making places for people in Jan Gehl's terms, and creating an environment where businesses can start to flourish and create, and it's that democratic approach to bottom-up creation of the draws that bring people in, that is the motor of London, an economic city that people want to go to. We'll never do this by central planning. We must do it by harnessing that.
But I'm not necessarily sure it's builders that should be in charge. It's a little known fact, it got sort of put under the carpet, but about 2 years ago the Office of Fair Trading fined 107 big building firms £129.3 million for corralling prices on PFI projects. And I don't think builders should be ruling the world. It should be Alan Stanton.
It should be the people.
But it shouldn't be the building professions. And I think it's a key thing about the detail of London is ruled by builders, because architects and designers have less and less power, especially in housing projects. And we need to invest more in housing at the beginning rather than doing maintenance. It should be, we'd spend £1,400 a square metre, and it should be at least £1,800 a square metre. But that's all to do with land costs, because land is too expensive and we don't build well.
The lady just there.
Feedback time. Lisa Taylor, Future of London. We're looking at 2 visits right now. Member, hello. 2 visits right now to organic, fine grain, etc., places, including Bermondsey, including Shoreditch, which people will argue are not organic in some ways. One is very branded right now. Shoreditch is very branded, but it has grown incrementally rather than monumentally. The same thing with Bermondsey. Steve Platts from Southwark was saying if we got what we wanted in the 90s, it would have been completely different and probably rubbish. So he said what we did was we shaped a little bit and guided a little bit, and now we're trying to keep it affordable for the people who want to live there. So it's different partnerships, and I think the partnerships already exist. Now Peabody's doing something interesting where they're opening their frameworks to smaller architecture firms, not having to go through the whole procurement process, so you're getting some different voices in there. That kind of innovation, and the fact that Berkeley Group's now looking at quantifying social sustainability and getting that onto their own people's portfolios and into councils, good things are happening. It's a question of getting these partnerships together and working together.
Thank you. Gentleman over there, and then the gentleman just standing there.
My name is Ron MacDonald. I am here representing the Institution of Civil Engineers, partner of London First. And I'd like to add an additional dimension to what we're talking about. I don't disagree with what's been said. But one thing I want to talk about is our public transport system. I know we complain about it a lot. One of the great things, legacies that's come out of the Olympics, is that the people who manage our transport system work together now when they didn't before. The bus people, the train people, the underground people, and so on and so forth, they actually coordinate, even with the police forces. They actually have a place where they coordinate it together. And our public transport system is actually I know it has its problems. I experienced them tonight coming here. But it is actually an incredible improvement. Why is that important?
So how does the
that
fact that they
relate?
all work together
No,
change people's experience of the transport system?
Well, it works better. It actually functions better. It's better coordinated than it was before, and so on and so forth. But I don't want to talk about the actual function of it. I want to talk about the effect of the public transport. Because the thing that sterilises most cities is the motor car. Yes. The great thing about London is we managed to get most people out of their motor cars. All right? And that's good for running a city. But it also is a great equaliser. We're all the same when we get on the public transport system. It's a great equaliser. The second thing is we have to walk to get to it. And we go out on the streets. So we share the streets together. So the public transport system is an incredibly important part of it. The next thing I want to say is the way Londoners use London is very gutsy, which is great. We actually like to sit in restaurants on pavements right beside buses and taxis that are pumped out diesel fuel. Don't think that it's just green parts, and I love the green parts, but don't think it's just the green parts. It's very often the really gutsy places that actually make London work. The last thing I want to say is, one of the interesting things that's happening in London at the moment is that the square mile, which was the most sterile area of London, is actually becoming alive. Why is it becoming alive? Because it's a place that people have discovered you can run clubs. And they have clubs at night which are actually getting quite wild and dangerous. But actually, it's keeping the place alive at night when it wasn't before. So there's a lot of really interesting things that come into the debate like that.
Thank you very much. The gentleman in the middle, yeah, just there. And then we'll go back over there.
Lee Mallett, commentator on the built environment. Bob's point about the population increase is really the key point for London, key political point. Added 1 million in the last 10 years, going to add another 1 million in the next 10 years. We need to build houses. That implies we need to create new homes at the rate of 100,000 a year, you know? That's sort of inconceivable. Second thing is that we are in this much more dramatic era of change, which is being driven by the likes of Crossrail, the Olympic Park. You know, so London has periodically looked at itself and then exported its key organs further out and made a bigger city of itself. And a dramatic change like that requires a dramatic response. The danger of sterility arising in London is if we don't recognise that it is an era of great growth and it requires radical solutions. And if you what's happening at the moment is that the inability to create housing fast enough is tending to create areas of sterility where you get more monocultural uses. People fight to preserve affordable housing in certain places, and they resist outside investors coming in and buying. Outside investors drive the market and drive value. It sheds off money that pays for the creation of new affordable housing in other areas. The redevelopment of housing estates and their renewal sheds off cash that creates more new housing elsewhere. What you can't do is planning policy often tends towards preserving things in aspect. Lots of people, for obvious reasons, want to keep things as they are. But if you do that, then you create sterility. Somehow or other, politicians have got to understand the era they're living in, local politicians, and project the need for change. And then you need people who can come up with imaginative solutions to accommodate change, which also accommodates social equity.
I just want to throw it back to the panel before we have some more questions. Do any of you, I mean, all of you were nodding in agreement when the comment was made about transport. I just wonder whether we can just address this issue of the huge amount of growth that is going to be needed, or the numbers of houses that are going to be needed, and how much of it. It's all very well to say that this doesn't have to be from top down, that this can be an organic thing, but when you're talking about those sorts of numbers, it's a political issue, isn't it? And it's a real political challenge to provide housing for the numbers of people that are going to be wanting to live in this city. Steve?
Yeah. Actually, can I say that I think Crossrail is a real opportunity in terms of that. It's opening up parts of London that really haven't been accessible before. I think it changes the geography of London, and I'm bound to say that with our newfound interest in Thamesmead, that actually it's, I think it's 11 minutes to Canary Wharf from Thamesmead, and sort of 5 minutes to Custom House, 11 minutes to Liverpool Street. You know, there's lots of space there, and actually one of the values of we're not creating more land, unfortunately. So actually we do have to build on spaces that haven't been developed, and we have to develop more densely. I think we need pressures on people to release developable land as well, and I think this is one of the issues, and you know, it's quite a controversial issue, and I don't know too much about it, but the idea of a land value tax, which taxes the sort of value of unused land, is something that we ought to consider. There's a lot of people making a lot of money out of owning land and doing nothing with it through Crossrail. They've just sat there, they haven't helped to pay for it, and we could use that money if they were paying, that could actually help us build the housing that we badly need. I think we've got to work with local people. We've found in doubling the size of an estate, actually the residents were for that. They went to the planning committee and argued for it in the planning committee to agree. It depends how it's handled. I think there's a big issue about supply, and I don't agree with Bob about these poor homeowners buying their homes actually subsidising the Section 106. I think the problem is, actually, if there wasn't Section 106, the developers would make more money out of it. Actually, it's the value and the shortage of housing in London that actually drives value. I think we're going to have to see a change in the London plan that's going to talk about 50,000 homes a year being provided. You know, we are really, population, as somebody said, is really growing. Actually, again, I've forgotten the question, but...
Don't worry, because we're going to get another question or a comment. The gentleman right at the back, followed by that hand that's gone up just there in the middle.
Good evening. My name is Peter Hall. I'm an Australian, and I helped set up a cafe in Soho called Flat White, which has set off a little mini revolution of vitality with lots of little independent cafes.
Where in Australia, not Melbourne?
Well, I was just going to come on to that. I'm actually from Sydney, but this is a very interesting point. But I work in Soho. I think every great city has a dirty and dangerous heart to it, and I see Soho having its heart ripped out of it by developers. For example, we have Shaftesbury Properties, who we call the wall of death in our little community of friends, as they extend up from Carnaby Street, and there's a huge sterility around them. We've seen Central St Martin's, you know, home of the Sex Pistols' first performance, being ripped out, put up at King's Cross, where there's a developer who's made it part of their agenda to grab that piece of creativity and vitality in the city. Some other things that are going on. Shakespeare's London was not a very equal city. And, you know, Leonardo's Florence was not a very equal city. So this drive for social equality is not necessarily something that's contributing to the vitality of the city. And maybe all those Russian billionaires coming in and sprinkling their money around is a source of vitality to the city. And the other thing is obviously the drive for...
The Qatari royal family.
Sorry?
Or the Qatari royal family. It's
yeah,
not just Russian billionaires.
Exactly. And also this drive for safety. I used to go to Soho in the 70s as a young lad, and you know, I was terrified of the place, but it was pretty bloody vital and exciting, the Clash hanging out there. So you need a place where the desperate, the marginal, the creative, the poor can congregate. And you know, we've seen it in New York with Times Square. That used to be a scary place, and now it's Disneyland. And what's happened is that all these places have had their life leached out of them by money, people saying, let's use this space to buy and sell stuff to the general public, rather being refuges for the marginal and the desperate. Just a final point, if you want to bring some more life to London, in Melbourne, there has been this easing of licensing laws, which have allowed lots of little cool, interesting bars to be set up, each with their own individual human character, and that's one of the great causes of death in London, which is chains. Instead of individual humanity, when we set up Flat White, we could have branded Flat White and set that up as a chain and rolled out 20 or 30 cafes, but I wanted us to set up cafes which are run by human beings rather than by corporations.
Fabulous advertising.
Etc.
Excellent. Leo,
Don't worry.
I I just wonder if you want to respond to this notion of cities requiring places for the marginalised at the heart of them, dangerous places of not of safety.
Yeah, but I felt I was sort of slightly confused, although I spend much of my time at Flat White. I feel that, mixing, you were talking about the threat of big money coming to Soho, and that these are the sort of, we won't have these vibrant small spaces if these huge, big, whether they're Qatari or whether they're Russian, coming in, having these small spaces. I mean, I think the joy of Berwick Street is because it is all to do with the small community, and it's perfect for that area. I don't think that we need to sort of create, as what I get the impression is, sort of creative ghettos. I think that's the wrong way of going about it. These places, these zones where we can be edgy. I think that there are undoubtedly places, and it's fluid, that where creativity rises and falls. I mean, I think when you look at sort of Tech City in the East End, coming around Old Street, you have a huge governmental investment in something called Tech City, but you had a huge amount of creativity there already. I mean, the report that came out from the centre of London sort of showed that there was this international marketing, but that was actually having an impact, and a poor impact on the actual creativity on the ground. So, I mean, I despite liking your coffee, I'm a bit worried about what you have to say about sort of creating these marginal zones. I think they're there, but I don't think, I think that they will appear organically, but I think they are under threat.
A couple of hands that gone up just over there.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Melissa Wolford. I'm the founder and director of the Museum of Architecture, and we're looking to open a permanent space next year. And our whole mission is to better engage the public with architecture. So we're very excited about that. But what I wanted to ask, and my comment is, we talk about these people that we're trying to engage with, and my question is, do we really know who those people are? And are we doing enough ethnographic research as to who those people are and listening to the various different groups before actually coming up with what we want to put in different spaces or put in the public realm? I guess my question is to you is there an opportunity to better engage with these people than the systems that we have in place at the moment? I'm curious about what your thoughts are on that. Anyone?
I think we don't engage with them at all, really, and we need to do that far more. And one of the best ways of doing that is actually, sort of offering them the space. It is, as it were, the people that will come to those places, and they will come and adapt it. So in some ways, it's about not seeing them as an abstract. I think it's a process. The way that one builds trust, there isn't a way of sort of finishing off on trust. It is part of the process and has to be engaged right from the very beginning. And that's users. It's the people who come across it. It's the moments of serendipity that occur there. It's very difficult to sort of do an ethnographic study, although there are people like Yangel who does do extensive ethnographic work before changing a space. But I think that there isn't the level of engagement. There's a lot of rhetoric, but there's very little engagement.
Well, can I just say? I mean, I think that I think there is a lot of work going on in London, and has been over the last few years, at thinking quite carefully about the way parts of the city can evolve, and doing a lot of consultation through that process. It's something probably driven more by the local authorities or by the GLA, who are looking at areas which are perhaps not being covered by other developments. I mean, I'm very aware around the Olympics, whereas there were people like us working on the master plan of the Olympics, there are a lot of people working on projects on the fringe areas, and who were, I think, carrying out that sort of work. But having said that, I also agree with Leo's comment, which is that in a way, public space is not really about, people people, I mean the state or the developer or whatever it is doing for other people. It is much more interesting when people do it for themselves. And I think that's one of the things at Copenhagen, which has already been mentioned. I think that is one of the things they have worked very hard at, actually. So I heard the city architect talk about it, and she said how they have a sort of simple motto. They want more of the people to use more of the public realm more of the time. So in City Hall, or wherever it is, if you want to do anything, if you want to have a street party, whatever it is, there is one number you phone up, and the person's job, unlike how it was, I know what it is now, but I mean it used to be like this in this country, there was one person whose job was to stop you doing that. Now, in Copenhagen, there is one person whose job it is to make that possible, and their whole thrust, therefore, of the kind of civic administration is to make it much, much easier for people to do things in the public realm. And I think in the end that is a more interesting way of the city evolving, rather than, well, top up. I mean, it's better if it comes from top down, better if it comes from bottom up.
But it's also really exciting when people in small populations in cities just decide that they're going to take over areas. I'm thinking about the Hong Kong Shanghai Bank in Hong Kong, the Norman Foster building, where the space underneath the bank is entirely taken over by Filipino families at the weekends. They just go and just hang out there, they take picnics, and it's a sort of concrete area. It's amazing. And he had no idea. He didn't even know that this was, so I think, in that respect, cities are incredibly organic and passionately so.
Can I provoke Leo then on that one? Because I bet that is private space.
It is.
And I bet it's used by the public. And I just don't think it matters who owns these spaces. What matters is whether they're accessible for use. But I know he'll now annoy me.
No, I agree. I mean, I think it's actually usage that makes something public. But I think it becomes more and more difficult to use if it is securitized, if it's watched, if there is private security, if there is a small plaque that tells you the rules of engagement within that space.
Nobody bothers about those. Nobody bothers about those.
Well, one would hope, but then strange things occur.
Can I just say about Copenhagen, one of the things that startled me, and I know it only through sort of organ and killing and things like that, and the bridge. But it's actually, Copenhagen is as big as Croydon. Actually that really illustrates a city in Europe is as big as one of our London boroughs, and that's the scale. I don't want to belittle what it's doing, but it does really enhance the scale of what we're doing. I'm not a planner, and I know there's planners in the room, but one of the things the government has done is introduce the idea of neighbourhood plans, actually, which are aimed to try and bring local people together, to try and say what they want in their area, and that's part of the planning structure with the local plans driven by the local authority. But actually, that may be a way of involving people. They're not as big as a borough, and they're only parts of areas. But I think they really didn't just ought to work in villages like Ambridge, but they ought to work in London as well.
Gentleman there, right in the middle. Do you need a microphone, or can you project?
I can project. Look, I think for everybody in this room, I think London is better than it's ever been. The schools are better, we've got better cycling, we've got the funkiest, grooviest, kind of biggest, design community in the world now, just had a fantastic... But if you're poor, I think we have to be much more granular in this argument. If you're poor, I think the first person who asked the question, I think Leah's talked about it, then I think you really struggle. We've been doing work in Tottenham, and there are communities there who really, really struggle. All around London, there are people who are marginalised, who actually find it very, very difficult to enjoy the public space, to get out, to kind of get a decent meal, etc. So I think if you're well off, if you're people like us, it's absolutely fantastic. But what do we do about everybody else who isn't? The 10,000 people who have been moved out, and the other, hundreds of thousands of people who are actually really struggling. So that, in a way, I think we're just not being granular enough about, in this debate. I think too many generalisations.
Anyone like to take up what we've just heard? Because it does feel like a sort of pretty vital question.
Well, you know, but
A challenge, perhaps.
I think one can only agree. I mean, I think one in many ways has to sort of start looking and thinking about citizenship as or the right to the city as something which isn't just about ownership of property. That there is obviously, as we've discussed, inequality and poverty in various areas, and there are a number of political things that absolutely have to be discussed, like a living wage, and obviously housing, and this sort of slightly strange word, affordable housing, which I think needs a big question mark around it. But as it was being said over here, things like transport is absolutely essential in creating a more democratic and a more mobile city, so somebody can get across the city to go and find work. So I think we have to sort of look at it on a number of different levels, and the city is actually fantastic opportunity, a space for opportunity, for creativity to solve these problems. The city might have a huge amount of problems, but it is also its own cure. And so we have to allow and think and discuss what are the rights of the cities, or what are the rights of the city that will allow a more equitable place.
Has anyone got a burning thing that they would like to say? Because we're kind of wanting to wrap up. The gentleman there in the glasses.
Okay. This is kind of related to older points, but I haven't had a chance to say it. Firstly, a couple of friends of mine who've been to Copenhagen, who aren't actually that interested in sipping sort of elegant flat whites and looking at architecture and admiring paving, have told me that they found it really quite a dull place to go around. That's just one.
Sterile, did they say?
The word particularly, but it was implied. Second thing, the gentrification train that we've been talking about. I think the people who drive the train are these sort of interesting, marginalised, not marginalised people, but kind of creative people who are looking for space that's cheap to make things happen. And they sort of drive this train, which is in carriages further on. We've got the sort of trendy people who are following fashionable sort of things, and then later you've got middle class families. I think this train is heading from non-sterile place to non-sterile place, sort of colonising it and bringing life to it. And I think there are fewer places like that in London as we're sort of amalgamating plots and buildings together to make big, giant developments. If you look at old pictures of the city, there are tons of tiny, tiny, tiny buildings, each one supporting all kinds of different activities, providing all kinds of different accommodation space. And now those plots are just one building with a sort of office on it. I think sterile places are possibly these big planned areas, and there are fewer and fewer of the sort of organic, sort of little scale places that I think are non-sterile.
Thank you. There's still there is still a huge amount to talk about, but we have run out of time. But there are still more opportunities to carry on talking to these guys and to each other, because there is an opportunity to network afterwards. But before we all go, I mean, it's very hard to sum up the huge scale of what we've been trying to talk about here this evening. But I do feel that what struck me the most is the sometimes visceral passion with which people talk about the city and this city, and a desire to make it better, and while acknowledging that there are challenges. So I love this city. I'm one of the 48 who doesn't think it's sterile, and it's a city that's shaped me, and I think cities shape people and people shape cities, and in a way it's our desire to have faith in that notion that will propel us forward. I'm not going to say any more except to say thank you very much to Bob, to Sue, to Leo and to Steve, and to all of you for taking part. Thank you very much.